There are strong indications that loyalist paramilitaries have started to decommission their weapons. It's believed the government in Northern Ireland has been given full details of the historic move by the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF, and the Ulster Defence Association, the UDA. Winter floods and very hot summers have been predicted by government scientists who are looking at how climate change will affect Britain. Their forecast says that by 2080, London will be between 2 and 6 degrees hotter than it is now. An airline pilot has died while flying an American plane from Brussels to New York. The first officer took control of the Continental aircraft, which landed safely at Newark Airport.
Charles, thank you for that. It's 5:30. Normally at this point we'd bring you upstairs, having some trouble communicating with Nils in Dublin. Do hope to take you there just very shortly. But let's look a little more closely at one of the stories Charles brought you. This is something that's supposed to be a vivid way of demonstrating the effects of climate change. It's an online weather generator where you can enter your postcode and see projections of how things are thought likely to change within 25 square kilometre grid squares at different points in future. Environment Secretary Hilary Benn launched the UK Climate Projections Report today, telling MPs our climate will change even with a global deal on emissions. I've been hearing from someone who believes he sees the effects of climate change in his line of work, Rob Pentley-Jones, who's a Senior Reserve Manager for
things like butterfly populations over the last sort of 15 to 20 years. So it's one thing it clearly is happening is that there is an acceleration in the decline of some of our key butterflies, and that does seem to be related to much worse spring weather, much more rain in the spring, less sunshine, and the butterflies are just not able to cope with those very rapid changes.
What's the knock-on effect of that?
Well, it could be quite significant. What we are seeing is the impact on things like butterflies, these very obvious creatures, but this is probably also impacting on all the other insects that perhaps we are not noticing the decline in, and that could have very major effects on things like our insectivorous birds and mammals like bats, which absolutely rely on the insects to survive. We'll have a much less interesting countryside and wildlife.
And are you sure in your own mind, are you satisfied that the sort of changes you've witnessed are down to climate change?
It's clearly happening. We're looking at populations of creatures, particularly insects, and there's certainly changes going on. And we probably are going to see some local extinctions. There are two butterflies that we are concerned about. There's one called the northern mountain ringlet, which lives on the tops of the hills in the Lake District. And the only way that can combat climate change is to move uphill, and it can only go so far before there's no hill left.
That's Rob Pentley-Jones, who works mainly in North Lancashire. I've been hearing from...
I think they will certainly help in focusing everyone's minds on what the realities of climate change are likely to be.
Do you think we don't know?
I think we're aware that climate change is happening, and I think the vast majority of people understand that all the greenhouse gases we're pumping out into the atmosphere aren't doing any good. But I don't think up to now most people have really understood what the full consequences could be. And the report that's emerged today will absolutely show what's likely to happen. Much more erratic weather, many more extremes. We'll have droughts, we'll have floods, we'll have heat waves, and we need to do two things above all in response to that. The first is to try and stop the emissions happening in the first place, and secondly, we need to prepare ourselves better so that we're better defended against things like floods and better ready for when they happen.
Is there not a strong argument for saying that everyone who's wanted to hear the message you've just outlined, and that's being outlined on a more local level, if you like, by these weather generators, everyone who's wanted to hear it will have heard it by now?
I think there's a lot of people, yes, who have heard it, who have already begun to think about changing their own behaviour, thinking about insulating their homes or driving smaller engine cars or whatever. But there are a lot of people who I suspect up to now have thought, well, climate change is something that's going to happen way into the future, and it's going to happen to other people, it's not going to happen to us. What these maps, what this report show, is that it is already happening to us, and it's going to happen to us even more intensively over the course of the next few decades.
But is the thinking that people need to be frightened, they need to be scared about what's going to happen, and then they'll think, that this isn't some distant problem, I need to do something about this now? Because, again, sorry to harp on, that message has been there, hasn't it?
I think people do need to know exactly what's likely to happen, and some of it is pretty scary. But I think we also need to give people a sense that there are things we can do to stop it happening. And we do need to take global action. We need to develop renewable energy much more effectively than we have. There are things we can do to help ourselves in all of this. And I think the message has to be one, yes, of reality and a little bit of concern about what it brings, but also one of hope that we can begin to fix this.
What will you and your colleagues do as a result of these projections?
Well, tomorrow we'll be publishing our forward plans for the next 25, 30 years, looking at what we need to do specifically in relation to flood defence. And this shouldn't be a partisan political thing. I mean, it's going to be the case whoever's in government. We need to make sure that we keep steadily investing in flood defence if we're going to protect homes and villages and towns and cities across the country.
It's a good point at which to end, actually, isn't it? Because I've heard it said only today from people saying, well, as long as we get the flood defences right, we spend the money on that, we make sure they're fine, I don't really have to worry too much about the effects of climate change. Thinking of changing my car and recycling and all that.
We also need to think about what's going to happen to agricultural production, where we're going to get our food from in years to come. We also need to think about water resources, because one of the perversities of all of this is, yes, we're going to have more flooding, but we're also going to have rivers drying up much more in the middle of summer. And thinking about where we're going to get our water resources from in 30, 40 years' time is one of the other aspects we're going to have to look at very carefully.
Lord Chris Smith. Well, as promised, let's talk more about our main news tonight, the growing criticism of the government's decision to hold the Iraq inquiry in private rather than public. As we reported earlier, there are some indications from Downing Street that Gordon Brown might give way in some aspects that have proved controversial. For example, he may be in favour of holding some parts of the inquiry in public. He's also asking the inquiry chairman to consider taking some evidence from people who are under oath. But Lord Butler joins me live. Thank you for doing that. Since setting out the terms of this inquiry, Downing Street has said it was never, and I'll quote them, never an issue of theology for ministers whether the inquiry was held in public or private. Does that diminish your criticism?
It diminishes it a little. I think that the government has moved a bit, and as you said, one of the things that they have said is that there should be some public hearings with the relatives of the deceased so that they can say what they want the inquiry to cover. But I think that they ought to go further than that. I mean, I think that if one's going to lance the boil of public mistrust about the reasons why we went to war in Iraq, the presumption should be that the evidence is in public, unless there are good specific reasons, as there may be in some cases, for holding it in private.
You know better than most people how these things work. If Gordon Brown had approached you to carry out this Iraq inquiry under the terms he outlined in the comments on Monday, would you have done it? What would you have said to him?
Well, what I would have said was that I think there are two purposes to a further inquiry. One is to learn the policy lessons from Iraq, and there are certainly some of those, and that could be done by the sort of inquiry that he's set up. But I think also, very importantly, there is the feeling of mistrust among the bereaved, but not only among the bereaved, that they were misled, perhaps even deceived by the government about the reasons for going to war. And if a further inquiry doesn't purge that feeling, it won't achieve its purpose.
But do any of those problems you've outlined amount to the government acting in its political interest rather than in the national interest? What did you mean by that?
Well, of course there is an obvious political interest in the government having fulfilled its pledge to set up an inquiry, but nothing further to be heard of it until after the election. And if the hearings are held entirely in private, and if they don't reach any conclusion until next July, then that will be the result. And so I think that that may have been a political motive on the part of the government for the form in which they set up the inquiry.
Again, in a sense, asking you to step into Sir John Chilcott's shoes, where we are now, with Gordon Brown writing to him saying, well, have some stuff in public if you want, think about doing business under oath. Is that acceptable?
Well, I think it's a step forward, but I don't think we've got to the end of this story yet. There is going to be a debate in the House of Commons next week, where the opposition parties, I think, are going to press